Ominous wind howls. A faded black and white photo flickers. A rural farmhouse, 1913. Narrator, cold, measured. In the summer of 1913, a farmhand in Clay County, South Dakota, found something the human mind isn't built to see. At dawn, the wheat was heavy with dew, and in the center of the field, laid out in perfect symmetry, were the bodies of 3 missing children. Their hands were clasped, their eyes open. Pinned to one child's chest was a small wooden toy, hand-carved, crudely painted red. The carving was of a boy's face, smiling. That morning, the sheriff wrote in his report, "The toy appears to have been carved by another child. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just a trail of wheat bent in a spiral, leading back to the farmhouse where an 11-year-old named Ephraim Cole lived with his mother." And from that moment, a whisper began across the Dakotan plains, a whisper about the boy who watched people die without blinking. Static transitions to the sound of paper rustling, a ledger being opened. Before the killings, Ephraim wasn't a Cole at all. He was one of 27 children relocated from the Saint Verena Home for Wayward Youth, an orphanage run by the Lutheran Mission Board, closed quietly in 1909 after what officials called sanitary violations. But among the archives of the Dakota Territorial Records, there's a missing page, torn out between 1908 and 1909. Every child transferred from St. Verena's was accounted for, except one. A child listed only as number 12. When the Coles adopted a frail boy from that same orphanage that winter, the local pastor wrote, "He does not cry. He only watches." Some claimed St. Verena's wasn't an orphanage at all, but a behavioral experiment, funded by the Bureau of Mental Hygiene, testing moral rehabilitation methods on children of defective temperament. They called it science. The locals called it God's mistake. Low hum of flies, creak of wood, distant crows. The Cole family barn stood 3 miles from Vermilion Creek, a weather-worn structure, never painted, never locked. When investigators searched it after the discovery in the wheat field, they found something stranger than the bodies, marks etched into the walls. Not symbols, not letters, but dozens of tiny lines, grouped in 7s, carved by a blade no larger than a child's penknife. Each grouping was followed by a date. The first mark dated back to October 1909, for years before the murders, for years before Ephraim was even known to live there. On the dirt floor beneath those carvings, a mound of ash and small animal bones, hundreds of them. Birds, rodents, kittens. The autopsy later confirmed the children in the wheat field died the same way the animals did. Their throats crushed cleanly, no hesitation wounds. Forensic language fails to describe intent like that. It was practice. Echoing church bell, pages turn. The tone shifts from factual to faintly theological. Weeks before the murders, Reverend Abel Norton of St. Lydia's Church wrote a confidential letter to the county board. It was never sent. It was found later, sealed in his Bible, pages brittle with mold. "The boy prays differently," the Reverend wrote. "He doesn't recite the Lord's Prayer, but mimics it, word for word, tone for tone, as if repeating something heard through a wall. When he prays, the other children grow quiet. Some start to weep." The Reverend describes waking one night to see Ephraim standing outside the church, barefoot in the frost, facing east, towards St. Verena's ruins. "He stood still for an hour," the Reverend wrote, "until I spoke his name. Then he turned, and smiled, and said, 'They still hear us.'" A week later, the Reverend resigned and left town. His successor refused to open the East Chapel again. Static flickers. A photograph fades in, cracked, sepia-toned. Children lined up in an orphanage yard. In 1924, over a decade after Ephraim Cole was executed by hanging at age 16, an archivist in Pierre uncovered a mislabeled box from the Saint Verena estate sale. Inside, ledgers, rosaries, broken toys, and one photograph. 27 children stare into the camera, each tagged with a number on their collar. But the archivist counted 28 faces. The extra face, small, pale, almost translucent, stands slightly behind the others, half obscured. No number. Eyes unfocused, mouth open in the faintest smile. Experts claimed it was a double exposure. But the negatives, when tested, contained no overlapping emulsion, no evidence of a photographic error. And scrawled on the back, in a child's handwriting, were 3 words. "He stayed here." Sound of a typewriter clacking, then stopping abruptly. The faint ticking of a clock. Sheriff Walter Deems was a quiet man, a veteran of the Spanish-American War, not prone to superstition. His 1913 report on the Cole case ran 72 pages, but only 12 remain in the public record. The rest were removed by state order for moral sensitivity. What survived paints a portrait of procedural collapse. The sheriff's own words: "The boy does not blink during questioning. He answers only if one asks his name. He has memorized the details of the killings as though recounting someone else's dream." Deems noted Ephraim's drawings, dozens of them, done in charcoal and animal blood on the barn walls. Each showed the same image: a large house with 27 windows, and in every window, a hand pressed against the glass. The sheriff later told a journalist that when he counted the drawings again, the number of hands had changed. He never spoke publicly after 1915. In 1922, his family found him hanged in his study, the word "listen" carved into the underside of his desk. Crackling phonograph recording, faint female voice, trembling under static. The last surviving audio of Martha Cole was recorded during her 1913 sanity evaluation at Yankton State Asylum. Her voice is brittle, almost childlike. "He wasn't mine," she whispers. "They brought him here on a Sunday. Said he was good with chores. But he never ate with us. Never slept long. Sometimes I'd wake and he'd be standing in the hall, just standing." When asked if she noticed violent tendencies, she says something the examiner dismisses as hysteria. Not violence. Repetition. He practiced faces. In the mirror, he'd smile, stop, then smile again, like he was trying to remember how it's done. Later, her file notes an episode where she screamed uncontrollably at the sight of her reflection. Within a month, she was declared unfit for testimony and permanently institutionalized. Her burial record lists her under a different surname. In the asylum registry, her grave number, 218, is crossed out. Beside it, faintly penciled, are the words, "She followed him home." Wind over empty plains. Faint church bell echoing miles away. After Ephraim's execution, the town of Vermilion sealed its collective memory. No memorials. No sermons. No graveside markers. Within 2 years, most of the original families relocated, citing drought, but always leaving before harvest. The property where the Cole farmhouse once stood was later bought by the state and plowed under for wheat research. Nothing grows evenly there. Farmers complain of one patch that remains bare, circular, 12 feet wide, soil darker than the rest. Children in the area whisper that at night, if you walk past that patch, the wind doesn't sound like wind. It sounds like breathing. The University of South Dakota's Folklore Department catalogued the legend in 1948. Their conclusion: local superstition rooted in rural isolation. But one note in the faculty margin reads, "If superstition, why did no one ever build there again?" Sound of a metal drawer opening, then paper shuffling. In 1937, archivist Thomas Reddick was tasked with digitizing psychiatric case logs from the Bureau of Mental Hygiene, one of many Depression-era record recoveries. Among thousands of files, he found a folder labeled Project Orphanage, marked with a red X. Inside, photographs of children, handwriting analyses, and a typed summary titled Behavioral Conditioning Through Isolation and Ritual Reenactment. The document detailed experiments conducted at Saint Verena's Home for Wayward Youth between 1901 and 1909, the same orphanage Ephraim came from. The goal: to reprogram empathy through controlled exposure to violence. Children were forced to mimic emotions, smile, weep, pray, until the reactions became reflexively obedient. Most test subjects died or were transferred, but one, identified only as Subject 12, demonstrated full disassociation and mimicry beyond prediction. The last line of the report reads, "Subject 12 has been relocated to civilian care for long-term observation. Adoptive identity issued. Cole, Ephraim." Rain hits tin roof. Distant thunder. Dr. Lionel Faraday, director of Saint Verena's, disappeared in 1909 after the orphanage's closure. But in 1941, his signature surfaced again, on a requisition form from a Chicago medical institute, requesting juvenile tissue samples for neurological study. Investigators followed the trail to a private asylum outside Sioux Falls, long abandoned, its nameplate corroded beyond legibility. Inside, they found Faraday's personal notes, preserved in sealed jars. Each page recorded detailed behavioral sequences in neat handwriting: hunger, sleep, imitation, silence. But one jar contained something else: a child's tooth, embedded in yellowing paper. The label beneath reads simply, "Cycle incomplete." In a final letter, never mailed, Faraday wrote, "Conscience is learned through echo. Remove the echo, and you remove guilt." The boy was not born without feeling. We took it from him. The letter ends mid-sentence. The next page is blank, save for a handprint, small, pressed in dried blood, facing backward. Footsteps down a long corridor. Faint hum of fluorescent light. In 1920, Yankton State Asylum began cataloging its earliest patient recordings for clinical review. Among them, a series of wax cylinders labeled only with numbers. Cylinder number 218, the same number as Martha Cole's grave, contains a woman's whispering voice. The transcription reads, "He keeps coming for roll call. I hear the boots, the knock. They count to 12, but there are 13. Doctors dismissed it as delusional recursion, an echo of trauma. But the same sequence of knocks, 12 slow, 1 sharp, appears in 4 other patient logs from that year. When a janitor destroyed the cylinders during renovation in 1932, he filed a complaint. They were still warm. The institutional board deemed it mechanical friction. No one asked why the boxes were damp, as if they had been breathing. Radio static and faint swing music fading to silence. 11 years after Ephraim's execution, another South Dakota farming family, the Rains, were found dead. The scene mirrored the Cole killings. 3 children arranged in a perfect spiral, eyes open, mouths filled with wheat husks. But the youngest Rain child was missing. A week later, a train conductor reported a boy wandering the tracks near Vermilion Creek. He said the child spoke without moving his lips, repeating one phrase. "They told me to finish." The boy was never identified. His fingerprints matched none in state records. His birth certificate, and signed, "Location unknown," listed the surname Verena. The sheriff who investigated sealed the files permanently. In the margin of his notes, "Same eyes. Echo of church organ, 1 cord held too long." In 1926, St. Lydia's Church burned to its foundation. Among the debris, firefighters discovered a half-charred notebook belonging to Reverend Abel Norton, the same man who once wrote that the boy prays differently. On the surviving page was a sermon titled "The Children Without Echo." If God made us in his image, then reflection is mercy. But some were born in the gap between image and echo, where prayer has no return. They do not speak to God, they teach him silence. Beneath the sermon, scrawled in different ink, were 4 words. He was not alone. No insurance records list the cause of the fire. No new church was built. For decades, the townspeople claimed that on cold mornings, the sound of an organ could still be heard rising from beneath the soil. Film reel turning, then snapping. Archivist Thomas Reddick, the man who uncovered Project Orphanage, was found dead in his office in 1938. He had suffocated himself with a filing cloth. On the wall above his desk, he had pinned 27 index cards in a spiral pattern. Each card bore the name of a child listed from Saint Verena's records. All except one. The missing name, number 12, was replaced by a small photograph of Reddick's own son. His widow testified that, in the weeks before his death, Thomas began talking in his sleep, calling out names that weren't theirs. When she confronted him, he said, "They're practicing again." The Bureau classified his death as nervous exhaustion. The cards were destroyed, but a janitor who removed them swore one had been wet on the back, as if someone had been holding it in their mouth. Reel-to-reel clicks, faint distortion. In 1951, construction workers renovating the old Yankton administration building found a sealed vent. Inside, a single reel of magnetic tape, wrapped in medical gauze. The recording lasts 7 minutes. The first 2 are silence. Then, a rhythmic tapping, 12 slow knocks, 1 sharp. A man's voice enters, whispering. Cycle incomplete. Begin again. Then, unmistakably, a child's laughter. High, steady, unbroken. The sound distorts, slows, until it merges with the low whine of machinery. Audio specialists concluded the tape was spliced from unrelated hospital recordings. But frequency analysis revealed something beneath the distortion, an inaudible pulse registering at the exact rhythm of a human heartbeat. When the file was logged, the archivist added a note. Playback triggers acoustic resonance in metal vents. Recommend sealing this room. That room, room 12B, was sealed and remains sealed today. Typewriter keys clack under a low jazz radio hum. Then the music cuts abruptly. In 1953, journalist Helen Greer of the Sioux Falls Chronicle began researching a feature on forgotten state institutions. Her investigation into Saint Verena's was meant to be brief. 3 weeks later, she was gone. Her last known interview was with a former nurse from the orphanage's medical wing, a woman identified only as Mrs. L. The nurse described nightly recitations, where children were made to repeat words whispered from behind a curtain. When asked who was behind it, she said, "We didn't see them. We only heard their breath, like someone standing too close to the receiver." Greer's notes in mid-sentence. The boy was not the first. They said he was the only one who. 2 months later, her car was found abandoned near Vermilion Creek. The trunk contained her typewriter and a single roll of undeveloped film. The negatives showed 12 children sitting in a circle, holding mirrors. In each reflection, 13 faces. Wind through hollow hallways, faint drip of water, footsteps crunching on glass. By 1955, the ruins of Saint Verena's had nearly vanished beneath prairie grass. A state demolition crew arrived to level the last remaining structures. They reported strange resistance from the soil, tools dulling, machines failing without cause. Foreman's log, day 2. South wing completely cold. Compass spins. We can hear something like humming when we dig deeper. When the foundation was finally breached, they found a sublevel not listed on any blueprints. 27 identical rooms, each 8 feet wide, each containing a wooden chair bolted to the floor. On the far wall of room 12, carved into plaster. Say it again. The demolition halted. That night, 2 workers didn't return home. Their shovels were found arranged in a spiral at the base of the hill. The report was filed, then sealed. Sound of a projector starting up, low hum of an old recording. The 1957 federal inquiry into unauthorized psychological experimentation briefly reopened the Saint Verena case. Records show a panel of 4 officials from the Department of Health, the War Office, and the newly formed CIA Behavioral Sciences Division. Their transcript is dry, bureaucratic, until page 42. Chairman, what about the surviving subject? Agent, no confirmed survivors. Chairman, then who submitted this handwriting sample? Agent, unknown. Delivered anonymously. Postmarked Vermilion. The handwriting matched that of Dr. Lionel Faraday, who, by then, had been dead for nearly 15 years. When the panel requested to exhume his remains for verification, the cemetery records returned a single note. Grave untraceable. Section 12 collapsed. No further federal documents were released. The inquiry dissolved the following year. Its final memo states simply, if the cycle persists, it will adapt to supervision. Static overtakes an old broadcast recording. Footsteps echo across empty streets. In 1961, census takers reported an anomaly in Clay County. The town of Harlow, founded in 1915 on the former coal property, showed a population drop from 142 to 0 between April and August. No evacuation orders. No disaster records. When state police arrived, every home was empty. Plates still set for dinner. Radios still on. In several basements, the same phrase was carved repeatedly into the walls. We heard him knocking. Government records listed Harlow as dissolved for non-residency. No relocation data ever surfaced. By 1970, aerial maps showed no sign of the town, only faint outlines in the wheat, spiraling inward like a fingerprint. Local pilots refused to fly over it, claiming their instruments lost calibration. When forced to, they said the air above the site felt thicker. One described it as like flying through a whisper. Hospital ambience. Beeping fades into a low heartbeat. A tape recorder clicks on. In 1964, a senile patient at a Sioux Falls hospice began drawing spirals on the walls with her fingernails. Her name, Eleanor Deems, granddaughter of Sheriff Walter Deems, the original investigator. When questioned, she said she was waiting for the boy. Asked which boy, she replied, the one they hung, the one they let in. Her drawings were examined by psychologists and found to be identical to the carved spiral discovered in the coal wheat field 50 years earlier. Before her death, She left one final statement to her nurse, written in shaking script. "He isn't gone. He just learned to wear new faces." Her room was sealed after her passing. But when the orderlies returned to repaint the walls, the spirals were gone. In their place, handprints, 12 of them, all facing inward. Soft wind across open fields. The faint click of a camera shutter. In 1973, aerial surveyor Mark Litton was photographing crop density for the Department of Agriculture. Frame number 442 captured what looked like a pattern in the wheat outside Clay County. A spiral roughly 30 yards wide, darker than the rest. For days later, the pattern vanished. So did Litton's negatives. His supervisor filed a brief internal note, referred to historical division, anomaly linked to defunct site number 12. When the film canister resurfaced years later, the frames showed light warping only at the center of the spiral, an optical effect consistent with heat distortion. But no scorch marks were ever found on the ground. The official report called it lens fatigue. Locals called it a reminder. Buzz of an old cassette player. Faint wind, then a distant metallic tapping. Audio technician Ralph Fenner, contracted by a South Dakota public radio station, was testing outdoor microphones near Vermilion Creek when he recorded a low pattern of 12 rhythmic knocks followed by one sharp strike. Spectrographic analysis confirmed the sound was not echo. Each knock originated from a slightly different direction. The sequence matched the pattern logged in asylum cylinders from 1920. Fenner turned the tape into the station and requested that it not be aired. A month later, he mailed a letter to a friend. "When I slowed it down, there's breathing between them. You can hear someone waiting for the next knock." He stopped working in audio soon after. The tape remains in the station's archives, unlabeled, stored in Box 12B. Office ambience, buzzing light, distant elevator chime. By 1980, historian Dr. Margaret Kane led a state initiative to digitize early-century institutional records. Her memo dated May 14th reads, "Avoid uploading any material tagged Verena or Orphanage to open databases. The files contain corrupted metadata that replicates across drives." When questioned, she insisted the corruption was not digital, but behavioral, that staff handling those files reported insomnia, mirror aversion, and recurring auditory patterns. Her recommendation: store the remaining reels and transcripts in a single offline repository labeled C12. 6 months later, Dr. Kane resigned without explanation. Her last handwritten note: "If it spreads through language, stop reading it aloud." Shortwave radio static, oscillating tone. In 1984, ham radio operators across the Midwest began reporting an intermittent broadcast on 12.12 MHz. The signal lasted less than 1 minute, repeating every 12 hours. Recordings captured a faint hum, then a child's voice counting softly to 12, followed by a single, distorted syllable, possibly again. Federal communications agents traced the signal to an area near the former Cole property, now state-owned research land. No transmitter was found. The incident was written off as frequency overlap from agricultural telemetry. Yet the pattern of 12 and 1 recurred in later test transmissions, always centered on the same coordinates. To this day, local operators call the channel the prayer band. Cold, archival tone. Projector reel starting, then slowing. In 1990, a university team attempted a full reconstruction of the Saint Verena case using surviving documents, weather logs, and court transcripts. Their goal: to build a chronological database of every verifiable event. Halfway through, the lead researcher noted that whenever they tried to close the dataset, an extra entry appeared, timestamped 12 seconds after the final record. Each duplicate line contained the same phrase: "Cycle incomplete." The project was quietly discontinued. The database, once public, now redirects to a blank page bearing only an error code, 1212. A maintenance technician later admitted the code was chosen intentionally, just to keep the pattern consistent. He smiled when he said it, but his eyes didn't move. Distant hum of fluorescent lights. Slow echo of footsteps down a corridor. In 1994, state contractors renovating the former Yankton Administration Building, abandoned for decades, were assigned to reopen sealed wings for asbestos removal. One of those wings was labeled Room 12B, closed since 1951. When the crew broke the seal, they reported an immediate static interference on their radios. Inside was a small office, walls lined with shelves, a single reel-to-reel recorder still plugged into the wall. The recorder's power indicator flickered once. The tape was blank. Yet when archived under magnetic scan, it produced a pattern of faint electrical impulses spaced evenly, 12 short, 1 long. Technicians logged the anomaly as residual field activity, unknown source. The room was resealed within 24 hours under environmental protocol. It remains listed as structurally unstable. Paper rustling, faint ticking of a wall clock. In 2001, state archivist Daniel Whitlow compiled the last surviving documentation related to Saint Verena, Ephraim Cole, and the Vermilion disappearances. His index covered 312 entries, cross-referenced with health, judicial, and property records. At the bottom of his summary he wrote, "No verified evidence of supernatural activity. The pattern of 12 appears to be an administrative coincidence resulting from cataloging conventions established in 1901. He signed and dated the report. Later review of his files shows one unnumbered addendum inserted out of sequence. It reads only, "Check drawer 12 before closing." No such drawer exists in his office furniture. Soft electrical hum. Tone of a modern computer starting up. Digital researchers revisiting the Cole file in 2012 noticed a recurring metadata tag hidden in scanned images. Verena_cycle 12, appearing automatically on every upload, regardless of file origin. No program could identify its source. A cybersecurity audit found that when any of the files were renamed, an identical copy reappeared elsewhere in the system within 12 seconds. The duplication stopped only when all images were taken offline. A final note in the audit reads, "Behavioral contamination not confirmed, but staff requested reassignment." Public access to the Saint Verena collection has been suspended since. Muted background of an archival TV broadcast. In 2018, a regional historian recorded an oral history interview with a surviving maintenance worker from the 1950s demolition crew. Midway through the recording, the man pauses, looks off camera, and says quietly, "You're standing where we buried the chair." When asked what he meant, he smiled faintly and refused to elaborate. The footage ends seconds later due to equipment malfunction. Subsequent frames show faint distortion forming a spiral in the center of the screen. Technical analysts called it compression error, but the camera used film. Silence. Then the slow fade of wind across the prairie. Narrator, cold, final. The official record of Ephraim Cole ends in 1916 with a signature on an execution warrant and a single line. Cycle terminated. Yet for more than a century, documents, sounds, and patterns have continued to surface, each repeating the same structure, each closing with the same unfinished phrase. What began as an orphanage experiment became a century of echoes, scientific ambition, bureaucratic secrecy, the machinery of control repeating itself until no one remembers its origin. Some call it folklore. Some call it data corruption. But every generation finds its own version of the spiral. 12 turns, 1 center. And in the center, always a child's voice, practicing the sound of remorse. A pause. Narrator. The South Dakota State Archive lists the Cole file as inactive. But when you open the digital folder, it doesn't close. It waits. Static swell. Cut to black.